What began as a 3-day war has turned into a black hole that swallows tanks, aircraft, and men at a pace Moscow simply cannot replace. Russia, once synonymous with military power, is now sending tanks to the front lines that belong in museums. And the truth is brutal. According to estimates, by 2026, Moscow might simply run out of weapons to keep fighting. After the Blitzkrieg failed back in 2022, the Kremlin changed its plan. If they couldn't win fast, they would win by numbers. The logic was simple, or at least it seemed to be. Russia believed it could crush Ukraine through exhaustion, flooding the battlefield with endless waves of armor, artillery, and men. It was the return of attrition warfare, the kind of combat that devours resources and turns every kilometer into a mountain of scrap. But reality was ruthless. With every attempt to advance, entire columns were annihilated by drones, precision artillery, and mines programmed to strike even rescue vehicles. On the map, what once looked like a growing offensive turned into an almost frozen front line, scarred by craters and destruction, the perfect portrait of a war that consumes but does not conquer. According to the independent database Oryx, which records only visually confirmed losses, Russia has already lost more than 22,600 pieces of equipment since the beginning of the invasion. Out of that total, about 13,000 are armored vehicles, BMPs, BTRs, and MTLBs reduced to burned-out shells across Donbass and Zaporizhia. And the most symbolic number, more than 4,100 tanks destroyed, damaged, or captured. To grasp the scale, that means every 3 days, Russia loses the equivalent of an entire tank battalion. Even with factories working around the clock, the Russian defense industry can only replace a fraction of that, often using cannibalized parts or vehicles pulled from Soviet-era storage. And what's most striking is that these estimates are conservative. Oryx itself admits that the real losses could be 50% higher, since not every destruction is captured on camera. Compared to Ukraine's losses, Russia's are at least double, a portrait of a saturation tactic that has become a grinder of steel and soldiers. In both numbers and logic, Putin's war of attrition is working, but against himself. This Russian strategy was built on one assumption, that the country had enough tanks to fight indefinitely. For months, that narrative was fed both inside and outside Russia, the idea that Soviet depots held a sleeping army of steel, ready to be reactivated at any moment. But as the numbers started to fall, the myth began to crumble too. At the start of the invasion, Moscow sent about 3,300 modern tanks into battle, all assigned to the first offensives. These were armored vehicles equipped with thermal sighting systems, Contact 5 reactive armor, and 125mm cannons, the most advanced technology in the Russian arsenal. But in less than 6 months, that modern stockpile went up in flames across the fields of Kharkiv, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia. Unable to replace its losses, the Kremlin turned to what was left, the tanks of the past. By mid-2022, T-62s began appearing, vehicles built in the 1960s, pulled from storage with visible rust, analog systems, and no chance against modern drones or Western anti-tank missiles. 2 years later, by the end of 2024, images circulating on Telegram and military channels looked like a bad joke. T-34s. Yes, World War II tanks being sent for reserve training. Russia, the same country that once built the most feared armored vehicles on the planet, now depends on 80-year-old machines just to hold its defensive lines. This timeline of degradation is the perfect portrait of the crisis, from modern tanks with thermal sensors and reactive armor, to models that still use cranks and optical sights. Modern warfare demands electronics, integration, and logistics. 3 things the Russian military-industrial complex can no longer sustain. And that leads us to the second point, a defense industry in collapse. Even with factories running around the clock, the math is brutal. Russia can produce roughly 250 new tanks per year while losing more than 1,000 in the same period. In other words, for every new tank that rolls off the assembly line, 4 are destroyed on the battlefield. Not even Soviet-era production rates during the Cold War could balance that equation. Before the war, Russia could refurbish about 120 tanks per month. Today, that number has dropped to 35, and many of those repaired vehicles roll out of the factories with severe structural issues. Engines past their service life, improvised welds, and missing sensors. These tanks return to the front as metal ghosts, ready to explode at the first landmine detonation. But perhaps the most symbolic image of this decay came from a recent scandal: the discovery of fake armor plating. Field reports and videos showed Russian tanks supposedly equipped with reactive armor that, once hit, were revealed to be filled with clay bricks and industrial foam. It was literal corruption forged into steel, a mix of incompetence and fraud that sent hundreds of crews to their deaths inside metal coffins. For an army that built its reputation on the power of its armor, this kind of revelation was devastating, and the projections confirm it. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, if the current pace continues, Russia will run out of tanks for large-scale offensives by early 2026. In other words, the arsenal that for decades upheld the myth of Russian invincibility is being consumed faster than any industry can replenish it. The country that once built tanks as easily as printing money is now struggling to recycle scrap metal and pretend it still has firepower. And when an army has to dig into its museums to keep fighting, the war is already lost. The Kremlin just hasn't admitted it yet. If the collapse of Russia's tanks seemed like the worst-case scenario, the reality runs even deeper. The Russian crisis isn't limited to the ground. It has also reached the skies and the artillery, the two pillars meant to sustain any modern army. During the first year of the invasion, the Russian Air Force appeared dominant. Su-34s, Su-30s and Su-35s roamed the skies in daily sorties, dropping guided bombs and missiles on Ukrainian targets. But that tempo came at a massive cost: extreme wear and tear. 3 years later, less than 75% of the fleet remains operational, and many of the jets still flying are pushing the limits of their maintenance cycles. What does that mean in practice? That many Russian fighters are in the air, only in theory. Without spare parts, mechanics are forced to improvise fixes that put pilots at serious risk. And the results are alarming. More than 60 aircraft have been lost without ever entering combat, victims of mechanical failures, overworked engines, and onboard systems that simply shut down mid-flight. These incidents rarely appear in official reports, but they're well known behind the scenes, especially since many have been caught on video, showing jets crashing in areas far from the front line. And if maintenance is the weak point, production is the final blow. With sanctions cutting off access to Western components, Russia can now produce at most 25 new jets per year, a ridiculous number for a country losing 40 to 50 aircraft annually in the war alone. In other words, Moscow is burning through its planes faster than it can build them. The modern air force of Russia is turning into a fleet of flying scrap, kept airborne by parts scavenged from wrecks that have already fallen from the sky. And if the situation in the air is critical, on the ground it's downright desperate. Artillery, once the pride of the Russian military, now depends on North Korea. Yes, the same country that once supplied the Warsaw Pact is now forced to import ammunition from one of the most isolated regimes on Earth. The dependence is so severe that satellites have already captured entire convoys of North Korean containers crossing the border into Vladivostok, carrying shells produced more than 40 years ago. The problem is that this lifeline came defective. Field reports indicate that up to 50% of the North Korean shells fail to fire, explode in the barrel, or simply never detonate. These are munitions from the 1970s and 80s, corroded, unstable, but still necessary, because Russia no longer has the industrial capacity to produce the 10,000 shells its artillery consumes every single day. For an army that once boasted of having the largest firepower on the planet, relying on North Korean bombs is more than an embarrassment. It's a public admission of logistical collapse. Today, every Russian shot is a gamble. Will it hit the enemy, or make the cannon explode instead? And if both the skies and the guns are already failing, what's left for a country that bet everything on its military might? After all the steel and gunpowder, what remains is the one element no industry can manufacture: the human being. And that's precisely where Russia now faces its most severe crisis. In the first months of the invasion, the Kremlin believed the casualties would be temporary, a short-term price for victory. 3 years later, independent estimates point to more than 1 million soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. It's a figure that rivals world wars and has shattered what was left of troop morale. Elite units have been wiped out and replaced by rushed recruits, sent to the front after just a few weeks of training. The shortage of armored vehicles has turned the Russian army into a human wave force, using attack tactics that resemble those of the last century, where men replace machines. The cost? Gains of just a few meters per day, paid for with hundreds of lives. And it's not just blood on the battlefield that's draining the country. It's the brain drain. More than 400,000 engineers and skilled technicians have left Russia since 2022, fleeing mobilization or the economic sanctions. These people were the backbone of the weapons factories, research centers, and maintenance facilities. Without them, the defense industrial complex is now run by improvised teams where experience has been replaced by political loyalty. The result is what the world is already seeing: planes crashing, defective tanks, and missiles failing before they even leave the launch pad. But if the human factor is running out, the economic one has already collapsed. The war has become a bottomless budgetary hole. With energy exports down 35% since 2022, the Kremlin has lost its main source of foreign revenue. At the same time, military spending has exploded, consuming about 40% of the entire national budget. Every new missile, every rebuilt tank, every mobilized soldier weighs directly on the economy. The ruble has been devalued, inflation has soared, and the cost of living has doubled in several regions. Russian economists, the few who still speak, admit the inevitable. There's no way to sustain this war beyond one more fiscal cycle without deep cuts. And those cuts are already planned for 2026, targeting exactly the civilian sectors, a tacit admission that the current model has collapsed. The country is literally devouring itself to sustain a war that has already lost its meaning. Every destroyed tank, every failed shell, every body on the front line is a reminder that Russia is burning what's left of its future just to delay the inevitable. In the end, the equation is simple. Without technology, without tanks, without soldiers, and now without money. Even Putin knows the game is over. Obsolete equipment, insufficient production, a decimated army, and a bleeding economy. The war of attrition that was supposed to secure Russia's victory is now destroying the very empire that created it. Putin now faces the dilemma every autocrat fears: 3 paths, and all of them lead to the abyss. If he retreats, he risks the collapse of his regime and the beginning of political implosion in Moscow. If he continues, he will drive his armed forces to total exhaustion. And if he negotiates, he will be forced to admit what the world has already realized: Russia has lost. In the end, the real question is no longer whether Russia can win, but how long it can delay total collapse. The clock is ticking, and this time is not on Moscow's side. And now, do you want to see how Ukraine turned Russia's offensive in Pokrovsk into a bloodbath? Watch Ukraine waited for Russia's Pokrovsk victory, then turned it into a bloodbath. And make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapters of this war.